My name is Adil, and today I want to take you on a journey. It's a journey through the heart of the American story, a story often written not in ink, but in blood. We'll explore the most significant wars fought by the United States, from the first defiant shots fired for independence to the complex and sprawling conflicts of the modern age. This is not just a recounting of battles and treaties, but an examination of how these crucibles of violence have forged and reforged the very soul of a nation. Each conflict in its own unique and often brutal way has left an indelible mark on our history, shaped our national identity, and defined America's ever-evolving role on the world stage. This exploration is meant to be a thoughtful passage through time. We'll move from the cobbled streets of colonial Boston to the muddy trenches of France, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq. Through this, we'll see a nation struggling with its own ideals, expanding its borders, and grappling with its power. We'll listen to the echoes of the past, the voices of soldiers, leaders, and ordinary citizens caught in the maelstrom of history. Their stories are the threads that make up this complex tapestry of war and peace, of sacrifice and survival. Our purpose here isn't to glorify conflict, but to understand it, to understand its causes, its consequences, and its profound human cost. By walking through these pivotal moments, we can begin to grasp the immense forces that have propelled the United States from a fledgling republic to a global superpower. It's a story of great triumphs and profound tragedies, of noble causes and controversial choices. So join me as we embark on this educational and solemn journey through the wars that have defined America. It began not with a roar, but with a murmur of discontent that grew into a defiant shout. The American Revolutionary War, from 1775 to 1783, was a struggle against the mightiest empire the world had ever known. It was a contest of wills, an audacious gamble for an idea, the idea of self-governance. On one side stood Great Britain, with its disciplined redcoats, its formidable navy, and a treasury that seemed bottomless. On the other, a patchwork of colonial militias, ill-equipped, often unpaid, and united by little more than a shared sense of grievance and a dawning dream of liberty. The war was a brutal, sprawling affair, fought from the snowy forests of Quebec to the sweltering swamps of South Carolina. The names of its battles ring through our history like bells. Lexington and Concord, where the first shots were fired. Bunker Hill, a costly British victory that proved the colonists' resolve. Saratoga, the turning point that convinced France to join the American cause. These were not grand, sweeping campaigns in the European style, but often desperate, scrappy fights for survival. The suffering was immense, particularly during the bitter winter encampment at Valley Forge, where disease and starvation were more lethal enemies than any British musket. At the center of it all stood George Washington, a Virginia planter who held the fragile Continental Army together through sheer force of will. He was not a military genius in the classic sense, but he was resilient, patient, and understood that the survival of his army was the survival of the revolution itself. He lost more battles than he won, yet he never lost the war. His leadership was the revolution's indispensable ingredient, the steady hand that guided a fragile rebellion through its darkest hours, transforming a collection of disparate colonies into a unified fighting force. The cost of this newfound freedom was staggering. An estimated 25,000 American patriots perished, a higher percentage of the population than in almost any other American war. The economy was in ruins, the currency worthless. Yet the victory at Yorktown in 1781, secured with the crucial aid of the French fleet, was decisive. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. An experiment had begun, a republic born from the crucible of war, its future uncertain, its survival dependent on the very people who had sacrificed so much to bring it into being. This was more than a war for territory, it was a war for a principle. It established the radical notion that a government derives its power from the consent of the governed. It lit a fire that would inspire future generations, not just in America, but around the world. The birth of the United States was a messy, violent, and improbable event, a testament to the idea that ordinary people, when bound by a common cause, could indeed alter the course of history and create, as Thomas Paine wrote, a new world. Less than 30 years after securing its independence, the young American Republic found itself once again at war with Great Britain. The War of 1812 was a strange and often forgotten conflict, a war without a clear victor, yet one that would profoundly shape the nation's character. The causes were a complex tangle of grievances: the British practice of impressment, seizing American sailors on the high seas and forcing them into the Royal Navy, trade restrictions that crippled the American economy, and British support for Native American tribes resisting American expansion on the western frontier. It was, in the eyes of many Americans, a matter of national honor. The war began with a surge of American optimism, a belief that the conquest of Canada would be, as one politician rashly declared, a mere matter of marching. This optimism quickly evaporated. The invasion of Canada was a series of embarrassing failures. The American military was unprepared, its leadership often incompetent, and its strategy disjointed. The British, though preoccupied with their titanic struggle against Napoleon in Europe, were able to mount a formidable defense, and their Native American allies, led by the brilliant Shawnee chief Tecumseh, fought fiercely to protect their lands and way of life. The conflict was marked by a series of brutal reversals and surprising triumphs. The fledgling U.S. Navy achieved a string of stunning victories in single-ship duels on the open ocean, with vessels like the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, becoming symbols of American resilience. But on land, the story was often one of defeat and humiliation. The low point came in August of 1814, when British troops marched into the nation's new capital, Washington, D.C., and set fire to the White House and the Capitol building. It was a national disgrace, a moment when the very survival of the Republic seemed to hang in the balance. Yet, from the ashes of Washington, a new sense of national resolve emerged. Just weeks later at Baltimore, American forces successfully defended Fort McHenry against a relentless British naval bombardment. The sight of the American flag still waving over the fort at dawn inspired a young lawyer named Francis Scott Key to pen the words to the Star-Spangled Banner, a poem that would become the national anthem, a testament to endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. The war had found its defining, heroic moment. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814, which essentially returned everything to the way it was before the fighting began. No territory changed hands, and the issue of impressment was not even mentioned. In a strange twist of history, the war's greatest land battle, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed. There, Andrew Jackson led a ragtag army to a stunning victory, cementing his status as a national hero. Though a military stalemate, the war fostered a powerful wave of nationalism, shattered the strength of Native American resistance in the West, and spurred the growth of American manufacturing, forcing the nation to become more self-sufficient. It was in many ways America's second war of independence. In the 1840s, a powerful idea took hold of the American imagination manifest destiny. It was the belief, almost religious in its fervor, that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. This ideology, a potent mix of national pride, racial superiority, and commercial ambition, set the nation on a collision course with its southern neighbor, Mexico. The Mexican-American War, fought from 1846 to 1848, was the raw and often brutal expression of this destiny made manifest. The immediate trigger for the war was the U.S. annexation of Texas in 1845, which Mexico still considered a rebellious province. But the deeper cause was a dispute over the border and President James K. Polk's unyielding desire to acquire more territory, specifically the vast lands of California and New Mexico. When a border skirmish along the Rio Grande resulted in American casualties, Polk had the pretext he needed. He declared to Congress that Mexico had shed American blood upon the American soil, a claim that, even at the time, was seen by many as a deliberate provocation to start a war of conquest. The war was a story of two vastly different armies. The U.S. forces, though smaller, were better equipped, better trained, and led by a cadre of highly capable West Point-educated officers, men like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. The Mexican army was larger but plagued by political instability, poor leadership, and outdated equipment. The result was a series of one-sided American victories. U.S. troops pushed deep into Mexican territory, capturing Santa Fe, securing California, and driving ever closer to the heart of the Republic. The campaign culminated in General Winfield Scott's audacious amphibious landing at Veracruz and his subsequent march on Mexico City. It was a brilliant but grueling campaign, a 260-mile trek through hostile territory that echoed Cortez's conquest 3 centuries earlier. In September of 1847, after a series of hard-fought battles at the city's gates, American forces captured the Mexican capital. The fighting was over, but the war had exacted a heavy toll. Over 13,000 American soldiers died, the vast majority not from combat, but from the diseases that festered in the army camps. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, was a victor's peace. Mexico was forced to cede over half of its territory, the lands that would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico a modest sum of $15 million. The war was a stunning military success that realized the dream of a continental nation, but it came at a profound moral cost, creating a legacy of bitterness and mistrust with Mexico. And more ominously, the vast new territories acquired in the war would ignite a firestorm of debate over the expansion of slavery, pushing the nation ever closer to the abyss of its own civil war. The American Civil War was not a war against a foreign foe, but a war against ourselves. It was honestly the Republic's greatest test, a cataclysmic struggle that pitted brother against brother, state against state. Fought from 1861 to 1865, it was a conflict born from a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the nation, a country founded on the principle of liberty that practiced the institution of slavery. For decades, this contradiction had been papered over by fragile compromises, but with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the long-simmering crisis finally boiled over. The House, divided against itself, could not stand. The war began in April 1861, when Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. What followed was 4 years of bloodshed on a scale previously unimaginable in North America. The initial belief on both sides that the war would be short and glorious was quickly shattered at the First Battle of Bull Run. It was a brutal awakening. The war would be a long, grinding, and savage affair, a modern war where the technologies of the Industrial Revolution, like railroads, the telegraph, and rifled muskets, were used to create slaughter on an industrial scale. The conflict raged across a vast continent, from the fields of Pennsylvania to the banks of the Mississippi River. The names of its battlefields have become hallowed ground, etched into the American memory. Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Gettysburg, the high watermark of the Confederacy. Vicksburg, the siege that split the South in two. It was a war of immense armies, of legendary generals like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, and of countless ordinary soldiers who endured unimaginable hardship, boredom, and terror in the name of the Union or the Confederacy. At the heart of the Union cause stood Abraham Lincoln. He was a president who grew with the war, his purpose evolving from simply preserving the Union to achieving, as he would later say, a new birth of freedom. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 transformed the character of the war, turning it into a revolutionary struggle for the abolition of slavery. It was a moral and strategic masterstroke, allowing for the enlistment of nearly 200,000 African-American soldiers who fought with extraordinary courage for their own liberation and the preservation of the nation. When it was finally over, with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, the nation was, honestly, irrevocably changed. The Union had been preserved, and 4 million enslaved people were freed. But the cost was beyond reckoning. More than 620,000 soldiers had died, more than in all other American wars combined. The South was left in ruins, its economy shattered, its social order dismantled. The war had answered the great questions of its time. The Union was perpetual and slavery was dead. But it left behind a legacy of deep scars and a new set of questions about reconciliation, justice, and the true meaning of freedom for all Americans. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was, as one statesman called it, a splendid little war. It was short, lasting less than 4 months. It was decisive, resulting in a swift American victory, and it was transformative, marking the moment the United States stepped onto the world stage as an imperial power. The conflict was ostensibly fought for a noble cause, the liberation of Cuba from brutal Spanish colonial rule. For years, Americans had been horrified by sensational newspaper accounts, the Yellow Press, of Spanish atrocities against the Cuban people. A powerful sense of sympathy and a desire to intervene had taken root in the public consciousness. The catalyst for war came on the night of February 15, 1898, when the American battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 sailors. Though the cause of the explosion was likely accidental, the popular press immediately blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the national rallying cry. Swept up in a wave of public outrage and patriotic fervor, President William McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war. The nation, eager to test its newfound industrial and military might, plunged headlong into the conflict. The war was fought on two fronts, half a world apart. The first major action took place not in the Caribbean, but in the Pacific. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron steamed into Manila Bay in the Philippines, another Spanish colony, and utterly destroyed the aging Spanish fleet without the loss of a single American life. It was a stunning victory that electrified the nation and signaled the arrival of the modern American Steel Navy. Suddenly, the United States had a foothold in Asia, and the scope of the war had expanded far beyond the liberation of Cuba. The fighting in Cuba itself was more challenging. Hampered by logistical problems and tropical diseases, the U.S. Army's invasion was a chaotic affair. The most famous engagement of the war was the charge up San Juan Hill, a bloody assault that made a national hero of Theodore Roosevelt and his volunteer cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders. Despite the difficulties, the American forces, aided by Cuban insurgents, were victorious. The Spanish army in Cuba surrendered, and soon after the Spanish fleet was annihilated as it tried to escape Santiago Harbor. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, in which Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States and sold the Philippines for $20 million. The United States, a nation born in an anti-colonial revolution, had suddenly acquired an overseas empire. This outcome sparked a fierce debate at home. Imperialists, like Roosevelt, argued that America had a duty to govern these new territories. Anti-imperialists, including figures like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, argued that acquiring colonies was a betrayal of American democratic principles. The splendid little war had ended, but it left the United States with a new and troubling identity as a colonial power, fundamentally altering its relationship with the rest of the world. In the summer of 1914, the great powers of Europe stumbled into a war of unprecedented scale and savagery. For nearly 3 years, the United States remained officially neutral, a distant observer to the horrific trench warfare that was consuming a generation of European men. President Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the tide of events, and Germany's increasingly desperate military strategy, would ultimately pull a reluctant America into the maelstrom of the First World War. The primary cause for American entry was Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. In an effort to starve Britain into submission, German U-boats began sinking all ships, including neutral American vessels, in the war zone. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, which killed over 100 Americans, had outraged the public. When Germany resumed this policy in early 1917, it was seen as a direct assault on American rights and lives. The final straw was the Zimmermann Telegram, an intercepted message in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. Public opinion shifted decisively, and in April 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war, framing it as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. The United States was woefully unprepared for a major war. Its army was small, its industry not yet geared for mass military production, but the nation mobilized with remarkable speed and determination. A draft was instituted, and millions of young men, known as doughboys, were trained and shipped to France. The home front was transformed as well, with massive government campaigns to sell war bonds, conserve food, and rally public support. The full weight of American industrial power was thrown into the war effort, providing a crucial infusion of men and material to the exhausted Allied powers. American troops, part of the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing, began to arrive in large numbers in 1918. They played a critical role in halting the final desperate German spring offensive and in the subsequent Allied counteroffensive that would bring the war to an end. In battles like Château Thierry, Belleau Wood, and the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, American soldiers proved their mettle, helping to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Their freshness and sheer numbers tipped the balance of power and hastened the collapse of the Central Powers. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the United States emerged from the war as a dominant global economic power, but the cost was high. Over 116,000 American soldiers had died, many from the Spanish flu pandemic that swept through the military camps. President Wilson went to Paris with a grand vision for a new world order based on his 14 points and a League of Nations, but his idealism clashed with the harsh realities of European politics. The U.S. Senate ultimately rejected the treaty and the League, and the nation, disillusioned with European entanglements, retreated into a period of isolationism, leaving the war to end all wars as a tragic prelude to an even greater conflict just 2 decades later. The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history, a global struggle against the tyranny of fascism, Nazism, and Japanese militarism. For the United States, it began not in the fields of Europe, but on a tranquil Sunday morning in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was a stunning blow, killing over 2,400 Americans and crippling the Pacific Fleet. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy, and a unified, enraged America declared war on Japan and soon after on Germany and Italy. The age of isolationism was over. The war effort required a national mobilization on a scale never before seen. American industry, dormant from the Great Depression, roared to life, becoming what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factories churned out an astonishing number of planes, tanks, ships, and guns. 16 million Americans from all walks of life served in the armed forces. On the home front, citizens planted victory gardens, bought war bonds, and endured rationing. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking factory jobs, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter, forever changing the social fabric of the nation. The war was fought across 2 vast and distinct theaters. In the Pacific, the United States waged a brutal island-hopping campaign against the Japanese Empire. After the pivotal Battle of Midway in 1942, where the U.S. Navy crippled the Japanese fleet, the tide began to turn. American forces fought their way across the Pacific in bloody battles for control of obscure islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each island was a fortress, fiercely defended by a Japanese enemy who would often fight to the last man, resulting in horrific casualties on both sides. In Europe, the United States joined Great Britain and the Soviet Union in a grand alliance to defeat Nazi Germany. American forces fought in North Africa and Italy before the long-awaited invasion of France began on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Normandy landings were the largest amphibious assault in history, a massive and costly operation that established a crucial second front against Hitler. From the beaches of Normandy, Allied forces pushed across France, fought the desperate Battle of the Bulge, and drove deep into the heart of Germany, ultimately meeting Soviet troops at the Elbe River as the Nazi regime collapsed. The war ended in 1945, first with Germany's surrender in May, and then Japan's surrender in August, following the cataclysmic atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States emerged from the war as the world's preeminent military and economic superpower, its homeland untouched by the devastation that had ravaged Europe and Asia. But the victory came at an immense price. Over 400,000 American lives were lost. The war had defeated the Axis powers, but it also ushered in the nuclear age and set the stage for a new, long, and tense global confrontation with its former ally, the Soviet Union, the Cold War. Just 5 years after the end of World War II, the United States found itself embroiled in another major conflict, this time on the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, was the first hot war of the Cold War, a brutal and often overlooked struggle fought to contain the spread of communism. It was a war of jarring momentum shifts, fought in a harsh and unforgiving landscape, and it would end not with a clear victory but with a frustrating and bloody stalemate that continues to define the region to this day. The war began in June 1950, when the Communist North Korean People's Army, backed by the Soviet Union, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. The North Korean forces quickly overwhelmed the South's defenses and captured its capital, Seoul. The United States, viewing the invasion as a direct challenge by international communism, quickly intervened under the banner of the United Nations. President Harry S. Truman committed American troops to a police action, a term that belied the savage intensity of the fighting that was to come. The initial months of the war were a desperate struggle for survival. Pushed back to a small defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan, American and South Korean forces were on the brink of defeat. The tide turned dramatically in September 1950, with General Douglas MacArthur's brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. The daring maneuver cut off North Korean supply lines and led to the recapture of Seoul. Emboldened by this success, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove deep into North Korea, pushing towards the Yalu River, the border with China. This advance, however, triggered a massive intervention by the newly established People's Republic of China. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers poured across the border, catching the UN forces completely by surprise. What followed was a brutal and chaotic retreat in the bitter cold of the Korean winter, one of the longest and most difficult in US military history. The war now entered a new and more dangerous phase, a bloody war of attrition fought along a line that snaked across the middle of the peninsula. For the next 2 years, the fighting devolved into a brutal stalemate reminiscent of World War I, with trench warfare, artillery duels, and savage battles for control of barren hills, with names like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge. Peace talks dragged on, frequently stalling over the issue of prisoner repatriation. Finally, in July 1953, an armistice was signed, ending the fighting. The agreement established a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, roughly along the 38th parallel, the original dividing line. No peace treaty was ever signed. The war had preserved South Korea's independence, but at a cost of over 36,000 American lives. It became known as the Forgotten War, a brutal conflict that ended where it began, leaving a legacy of unresolved tension and a heavily armed border that remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. The Vietnam War was the longest and most divisive conflict in American history. It was a war without clear front lines, fought in the jungles, rice paddies, and villages of a small Southeast Asian nation. It began as a limited advisory role and escalated into a massive military intervention, tearing American society apart in the process. For more than a decade, the United States invested its blood, treasure, and national prestige in an attempt to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam, a goal that would ultimately prove unattainable. American involvement was rooted in the Cold War doctrine of containment and the domino theory, the fear that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other nations in the region would inevitably follow. Starting in the 1950s, the U.S. provided economic and military aid to the anti-communist government in Saigon. This involvement deepened under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, who committed hundreds of thousands of American combat troops to fight alongside the South Vietnamese Army against the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force, and the regular army of North Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was unlike any the United States had ever fought. It was a counterinsurgency war with no clear battlefield. Success was not measured by territory gained, but by a grim metric known as the body count. American soldiers, most of them young draftees, faced a determined and elusive enemy, fighting in a brutal climate against an often invisible foe who could blend in with the civilian population. They endured booby traps, ambushes, and the constant psychological strain of not knowing who was friend and who was enemy. At home, the war became a source of profound national anguish. As the conflict dragged on with no end in sight, a powerful anti-war movement emerged. The war was broadcast into American living rooms every night, the first television war, bringing the brutal reality of the conflict home in a way that had never happened before. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a massive coordinated attack by communist forces across South Vietnam, was a military defeat for the North, but a psychological victory. It shattered the official narrative that the U.S. was winning the war and widened the credibility gap between the government and the American people. Under President Richard Nixon, the U.S. pursued a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops while increasing support for the South Vietnamese Army. After years of protracted negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, ending direct U.S. military involvement. But the peace was fragile. 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive. The South Vietnamese army collapsed, and the world watched stunning images of the chaotic evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The war was over. It had cost the lives of over 58,000 Americans, left the nation deeply divided, and shattered the consensus that had guided American foreign policy since World War II. In August of 1990, the world was shocked when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his massive army to invade and annex his small, oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. This brazen act of aggression, a clear violation of international law, threatened the stability of the entire Middle East and, honestly, the world's oil supply. In response, the United States, under President George H.W. Bush, orchestrated a powerful international coalition, deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to Saudi Arabia in an operation codenamed Desert Shield. The mission was clear: to defend Saudi Arabia and compel Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. For months, the world watched and waited as diplomacy was given a chance. The United Nations passed a series of resolutions demanding an Iraqi withdrawal, culminating in a final deadline. When Saddam Hussein defied the ultimatum, the coalition's mission shifted from defense to offense. On January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. It opened with a spectacular and overwhelming air campaign. For weeks, coalition aircraft and cruise missiles pounded Iraqi command and control centers, air defenses and military positions in both Iraq and Kuwait. The air war was a stunning display of modern American military technology. Stealth bombers, precision-guided munitions, and advanced surveillance systems gave the coalition total dominance of the skies. The Iraqi military, though large and battle-hardened from its long war with Iran, was systematically blinded and dismantled from the air. The world watched the war unfold on live television, with images of laser-guided bombs hitting their targets with pinpoint accuracy, creating the impression of a clean, surgical conflict, a video game war that masked the very real destruction on the ground. After 39 days of relentless air attacks, the ground war began on February 24th. The coalition forces, commanded by General Norman Schwarzkopf, launched a massive and brilliantly executed flanking maneuver, the left hook, that swept deep into Iraq, bypassing the main Iraqi defenses in Kuwait. The Iraqi army, already demoralized and decimated by the air campaign, collapsed with surprising speed. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendered, many without firing a shot. The liberation of Kuwait was achieved with remarkable swiftness. After just 100 hours of ground combat, President Bush declared a ceasefire and announced that Kuwait had been liberated. The Gulf War was a resounding military victory for the United States and its coalition partners. It had achieved its primary objective with relatively few American casualties, exorcised the ghosts of Vietnam, and reaffirmed America's status as the world's sole superpower in the post-Cold War era. However, the decision was made not to march on Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein, leaving him in power. This decision, intended to avoid a protracted occupation, would have far-reaching consequences, setting the stage for another more difficult conflict with Iraq a decade later. The war in Afghanistan did not begin with a conventional invasion, but with the searing trauma of a single day. On September 11, 2001, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, operating from safe havens in Afghanistan, hijacked 4 commercial airliners and turned them into missiles, striking the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and plunged the United States into a state of shock, grief, and, honestly, fury. In the aftermath, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, and its first target was Afghanistan, ruled by the fundamentalist Taliban regime that had harbored Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network. In October 2001, just weeks after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The initial phase of the war was not a massive ground invasion, but a combination of precision airstrikes and the deployment of small teams of U.S. Special Forces. These elite soldiers worked with local anti-Taliban militias, primarily the Northern Alliance, providing air support and guidance. This strategy proved remarkably effective. By December, the Taliban regime had collapsed, and al-Qaeda's training camps were destroyed. Many of its fighters, including Osama bin Laden, fled into the rugged, mountainous border region with Pakistan. What began as a swift and successful campaign to dismantle al-Qaeda soon evolved into a much broader and more difficult mission nation building. The United States and its allies committed to helping establish a stable, democratic government in Afghanistan and to rebuilding a country shattered by decades of war. This involved training a new Afghan army and police force, building schools and infrastructure, and attempting to foster a modern society in a deeply traditional and tribal land. The war shifted from a counter-terrorism operation to a complex counterinsurgency. The Taliban, however, was not defeated, merely displaced. They regrouped in Pakistan and launched a persistent and deadly insurgency against the new Afghan government and international forces. The war dragged on year after year, a grinding conflict of roadside bombs, suicide attacks, and firefights in remote valleys. The United States and its allies found themselves mired in a seemingly endless struggle, propping up a government plagued by corruption while trying to win the hearts and minds of a population caught in the middle. The single greatest victory of the long war came in May 2011, when U.S. Navy SEALs located and killed Osama bin Laden in a raid on his compound in Pakistan. After 20 years, 4 U.S. presidents, and the expenditure of trillions of dollars, the United States finally withdrew its last troops from Afghanistan in August 2021. The war had become America's longest, costing the lives of over 2,400 American service members. The withdrawal was chaotic, and the Afghan government and army, which the U.S. had spent 2 decades building, collapsed with shocking speed. The Taliban swept back into power, returning the country to the same state it was in before the war began. The long and costly conflict ended in a painful and ambiguous defeat, leaving behind a profound sense of loss and difficult questions about the limits of American power. The Iraq War, which began in 2003, was a war of choice, one of the most controversial in American history. It was launched on a foundation of shifting justifications, born from the trauma of 9/11 and the unfinished business of the First Gulf War. The administration of President George W. Bush argued that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein posed an imminent threat to the United States and the world. The case for war rested on 2 primary claims: that Iraq possessed a hidden arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, and that Saddam's regime had active ties to the al-Qaeda terrorist network. Despite significant international opposition and skepticism from weapons inspectors, the United States, along with a coalition of the willing, launched the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. The initial military campaign, dubbed Operation Iraqi Freedom, was a swift and overwhelming success. American and coalition forces stormed across the desert, and within 3 weeks Baghdad had fallen. The iconic image of a statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down in Firdos Square seemed to signal a triumphant end to a brutal dictatorship and the dawn of a new democratic era for Iraq. But the initial victory soon gave way to a long and brutal occupation. The rosy predictions of a quick and easy transition to democracy proved tragically wrong. As the weeks and months passed, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found, undermining the central premise for the war. The rapid dismantling of the Iraqi army and government created a power vacuum, which was quickly filled by a complex and violent insurgency. The country descended into a maelstrom of sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia Muslims, car bombings, kidnappings, and attacks on coalition forces. The war devolved into a grinding counterinsurgency campaign, a bloody and difficult struggle to stabilize a fractured nation. The human cost was immense. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed. Over 4,400 American service members lost their lives, and tens of thousands more were wounded, many with life-altering physical and psychological injuries. The war in Iraq became a source of deep division at home, marked by fierce debates over its legitimacy, its conduct, and its staggering cost. The United States officially ended its combat mission in 2011, but the legacy of the war continued to haunt the region. The instability and power vacuum created by the conflict became a breeding ground for new extremist groups, most notably the Islamic State, or ISIS, which would later seize large swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, requiring a new American military intervention. The Iraq War ultimately succeeded in removing Saddam Hussein from power, but it did so at a tremendous cost, unleashing forces of instability that continue to reverberate across the Middle East and leaving a complex and painful legacy for both the Iraqi people and the United States. Our journey through the major wars fought by the United States has taken us from the birth of a fragile republic to its rise as a global superpower. We have seen how conflict has been a constant and powerful force in the American story. The Revolutionary War forged a nation. The Civil War tested it and gave it a new birth of freedom. The World Wars thrust it onto the global stage, and the wars that followed have defined its role in a complex and often dangerous world. Each conflict, from the War of 1812 to the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, has left its own deep and lasting imprint on the nation's soul. These wars have been the catalysts for immense change, shaping our borders, our economy, our technology, and our very identity as a people. They have brought moments of great triumph and unity, but they have also brought profound challenges, deep divisions, and moments of national shame. They have been fought for noble ideals like liberty and democracy, and for more complicated motives of expansion, influence, and security. The path from independence to global superpower has been paved with both glorious victories and costly, ambiguous outcomes. Understanding this history is not merely an academic exercise. It is essential for appreciating the nation's journey, for grappling with the difficult questions of our past, and for navigating the challenges of the future. It reminds us that peace is precious and that the cost of conflict, measured in lives lost, families shattered, and futures altered, is always immense. The stories of these wars are, in the end, the stories of the people who fought them and the nation that sent them to fight. They are a solemn reminder of the price of power and the enduring human quest for a more perfect union and a more peaceful world.
Ready for a history adventure? Join our community. Subscribe to World History, smash that like, share with friends, and drop your thoughts below. Let's make history together. See you in the comments.